She was betrayed while pregnant and dragged into court, but then he realized his biggest mistake. From the outside, everything looked idyllic. A beautiful suburban home, 2 successful careers, and a baby on the way. Neighbors admired the couple for their apparent harmony, and friends often said they were the perfect match. The woman, 7 months pregnant, kept the house in order, smiled at every gathering, and supported her husband's corporate rise without hesitation. She believed in partnership, in building a future together, and had sacrificed her own ambitions to ensure the man she loved could thrive. To her, this child was the final piece in the picture of their perfect life. What she didn't see, what no one did, was the coldness that had slowly crept into his eyes. He had started working late more often. His affection had turned into mechanical gestures. And though she told herself he was just stressed, a quiet doubt grew louder in the back of her mind. There were moments when she would reach for his hand and find nothing but air. Nights when he turned his back to her in bed, claiming exhaustion, while she lay wide awake, gently holding her belly, whispering promises of love to the baby she hadn't even met yet. The man she had married, who once rubbed her shoulders while she worked late or brought her favorite tea on bad days, now seemed like a distant stranger. He still said the right words when needed, "I love you, you're amazing," but the warmth behind them had vanished. She ignored the change for weeks, convincing herself it was temporary. After all, he had once cried when they first saw the baby's heartbeat. How could someone who cried from joy over a heartbeat become so indifferent to the one carrying it? The morning he left the house without saying goodbye, she stood by the kitchen counter staring at his untouched cup of coffee. It had become a routine. She would wake up early to make his breakfast, pack his lunch, and wish him well before he left for work. But lately, he was always in a rush, barely acknowledging her presence. That day, she didn't hear the front door close. He had left before she even made it downstairs. She sat at the table, one hand absent-mindedly resting on her belly while the other clutched her phone. She stared at the screen, willing it to light up with a message from him, a sign that he still thought of her, still cared. But the screen remained dark. It wasn't just his physical absence she felt, it was the way his silence now echoed louder than any words could. She remembered when they used to share everything, silly jokes, secrets, dreams for the future. Now, silence filled those spaces. He no longer asked about the baby's name, no longer touched her stomach or smiled when he felt a kick. She wanted to believe he was just overwhelmed, maybe afraid of becoming a father. But she also couldn't ignore the growing number of nights he claimed to be working late or stuck in meetings that never seemed to end. Sometimes, she would call just to hear his voice, only to be sent straight to voicemail. And when he did come home, his scent had changed, faint traces of a perfume she didn't own, a tension in his shoulders that wasn't caused by spreadsheets or deadlines. It was something else. Something she feared naming. It was past midnight when his phone, left carelessly on the nightstand, buzzed. He had fallen asleep on the couch downstairs again, claiming fatigue, and she, used to it by now, went to bed alone. But that buzzing shattered the fragile calm she had forced herself to maintain. The name on the screen was one she didn't recognize, no contact photo, just S. Bennett. The message preview read, "Tonight was amazing, can't wait to feel your hands on me again." Her heart stopped. She stared at the words, unable to breathe. The room spun slowly, and for a moment, she clutched her stomach, instinctively shielding the child inside her. She wanted to believe it was a mistake. Maybe it was a client? A wrong number? But the truth screamed louder than her denial. Her husband was having an affair. She didn't open the full message. She didn't have to. The way he had distanced himself, the coldness, the change in routine, it all suddenly made sense. Her hands shook as she placed the phone back on the nightstand, untouched. When he finally came to bed hours later, smelling faintly of alcohol and something else, something expensive and floral, she pretended to be asleep. The tears streamed silently onto her pillow, soaking the fabric as she lay frozen, afraid to confront him, afraid to confirm what her heart already knew. In her silence, she mourned the man she thought he was and the future she thought they were building. The betrayal wasn't just in his actions. It was in every lie he told with a smile and every moment he chose someone else while she carried the weight of their child alone. 2 days later, he invited her to dinner. It was the first time in months he had initiated anything remotely romantic. Part of her wanted to believe it was a step toward reconciliation, a silent apology for all the distance and unanswered questions. She wore a simple blue dress that hugged her belly, tied her hair back, and even applied a bit of lipstick, just like in the early days. The restaurant was upscale, full of chatter and soft music. But the moment they were seated, she sensed something off. His eyes didn't meet hers. He was dressed impeccably, but his demeanor was cold, rehearsed. He didn't compliment her, didn't ask about the baby, didn't even pretend to care. Halfway through the meal, after barely touching his food, he leaned in and said quietly, "We need to talk." The words that followed shattered her. "This isn't working. I've been unhappy for a long time. I want out." She blinked, stunned. She asked if it was because of the baby. He shook his head. "It's not the baby. It's you. You've changed. You're too emotional. Too dependent." She couldn't speak. Couldn't even swallow the food stuck in her throat. He went on, saying he had met someone who made him feel alive again. A woman who wasn't dragging him down with mood swings and baby talk. The waitress arrived with dessert, and he casually dismissed her, as if he hadn't just demolished the world of the woman carrying his child. She felt eyes on them from nearby tables, the pity and confusion. But the worst humiliation wasn't public, it was personal. She had given him everything, and still, he threw her away like she was nothing. After that dinner, he stopped coming home altogether. No explanations. No phone calls. No apologies. His clothes vanished from the closet one morning, as if he had never lived there. Only the faint imprint of his absence remained in the half-empty dresser, the unwashed coffee mug on the counter, and the cold side of the bed she still reached for out of habit. She sat on the couch for hours that night, one hand on her belly, the other gripping the armrest to stop herself from falling apart. How do you explain to an unborn child that their father chose someone else before they even had the chance to be born? She couldn't eat. Couldn't sleep. Every sound felt like a reminder of what was missing. She would stare at the door, waiting for footsteps that never came. Days passed. She called once, then twice, only to be redirected to voicemail. Finally, when he answered, his voice was curt. "I've already moved out. It's better this way." She asked why. Why now? Why like this? And he simply replied, "Because I can't do this anymore." No guilt. No emotion. Just finality. She hung up and broke down on the kitchen floor. The pain wasn't just in the betrayal, it was in the fact that she still loved him. Loved a version of him that no longer existed. Her world was crumbling around her, but inside her, life still stirred. A heartbeat she couldn't abandon, no matter how abandoned she felt. And so, wiping away her tears, she whispered to her unborn child, "I will protect you. No matter what." It didn't take long for her to discover the woman's identity. A mutual friend mentioned, without realizing the impact of her words, that her husband had been frequently seen with a woman named Simone, young, poised, and freshly hired at the law firm where he worked. Suddenly, the pieces fell into place: the late nights, the distance, the indifference. She wasn't just anyone. Simone was a corporate attorney with a reputation for being ruthless and ambitious. The kind of woman who viewed life like a chessboard, always 5 steps ahead. And now, she was with the man who had promised to protect her and their child. What cut deeper was learning how Simone talked about her. She had been overheard saying, "She trapped him with a baby. He's finally free now." Those words echoed in her ears for days. It wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure. As if years of marriage and a child growing inside her meant nothing. She imagined them together, laughing at her expense, building a new life on the ashes of hers. The cruelty of it paralyzed her. Yet amid the pain, something inside her began to shift. If they wanted her broken, that meant she still had strength left to fight back. And she would. The letter arrived in a sleek, ivory envelope, unexpected, sterile, and cold. Inside, it was worse than she had imagined. Her husband had filed for divorce, claiming emotional instability and irreconcilable differences. But the final blow came in the last line: he was seeking full custody of the child, alleging that she was unfit to raise the baby alone. Her hands trembled as she read those words. It wasn't enough to leave her. He now wanted to erase her from the child's life entirely. He wanted to win, no matter the cost, even if it meant destroying the woman who once believed in him. She sat for hours, numb, unable to process the cruelty. Her belly stirred gently under her hand, a reminder that she wasn't alone, not really. This baby, her baby, was hers to protect. She wouldn't let this become a story where the villain wins. The thought of facing him in court terrified her, especially knowing he had Simone and a team of lawyers behind him. But deep within her grief, a fire began to build. She wiped her tears, stood up, and walked to the window. "I won't let him take you from me," she whispered to her unborn child. "We'll fight. And we'll survive." The next morning, she took the divorce documents and laid them on the kitchen table, staring at them in silence. The sun filtered through the window, highlighting the ink that would change everything. Her name printed next to his, the date of their wedding now marked as the beginning of legal proceedings. She didn't sign. Not yet. Instead, she reached for her phone, heart pounding, and began searching for legal representation. Every call felt like a reminder of how far she'd fallen, from wife to adversary. Most firms turned her away, citing conflicts of interest. Others quoted fees she couldn't afford. After hours of rejection, a quiet voice answered on the other end of the line: "Law Office of Anthony Calver." The man sounded older, calm, almost too gentle for the gravity of her situation. She explained everything, her voice cracking, but he didn't interrupt. When she finished, there was a pause before he said, "Come in tomorrow morning. We'll talk." It was the first time in weeks someone had offered help without judgment. She didn't know who he was or if he could truly help her. But in that moment, his words felt like the first solid ground beneath her feet. His office was modest: faded bookshelves, a desk cluttered with paperweights and framed newspaper articles. Anthony Calver was a retired family attorney in his late 60s, with kind eyes and a slow, deliberate way of speaking. He listened carefully, scribbling notes in an old leather notebook as she poured out her story. When she mentioned Simone, his brow twitched slightly. "I've heard of her," he said. "She's clever, but reckless. He nodded once more before leaning back in his chair. You've been wronged. And you have rights. If you're ready to fight, I'll stand with you. She felt her throat tighten. She had expected skepticism or pity, but instead she found resolve. Anthony wasn't flashy, and his office lacked polish, but something about his presence calmed her. Why are you helping me? She asked quietly. He looked at her for a long time before replying, because once, someone helped me when I had nothing. And because you remind me of my daughter. She didn't make it through her fight. But you still can. She nodded, wiping a tear. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she had a voice again. She wasn't alone anymore. The summons came a week later. The date for the initial custody hearing had been scheduled, less than 3 weeks away. Her hands trembled as she held the document, her breath shallow. It felt like a countdown to judgment, to a public display of every failure, every private moment twisted and scrutinized. Anthony sat with her in his office, calmly reviewing the paperwork. They're trying to paint you as unstable, he said, tapping his finger on one paragraph. But their evidence is flimsy. We'll dismantle this piece by piece. She nodded, trying to absorb his confidence, but fear still lingered in her bones. She had nightmares that week, visions of losing the baby in court, of hearing a judge say she wasn't enough. But every morning, she forced herself out of bed, ate when she could, and followed Anthony's guidance. She documented everything: doctor visits, texts, letters, financial records. The hardest part was preparing to see him again, to look into the eyes of the man who once held her at night, who now sought to erase her from their child's life. And when the day finally came, she stood at the courthouse steps, hand resting on her belly, eyes steady, whispering to herself, "He doesn't get to decide my worth." The courtroom felt colder than she imagined. Pale walls, high ceilings, and the sharp scent of wood polish clung to the air like a warning. As she entered, eyes turned toward her, some curious, others judgmental. She clutched her documents and walked slowly, aware of every step. On the opposite side of the room, her husband sat confidently beside Simone, both dressed impeccably. He didn't even glance at her. It was as if she had become invisible, just another obstacle he intended to remove with precision and ease. Her chest tightened, but she held her head high and met the judge's eyes with quiet dignity. The hearing began with formalities, but the emotional weight fell quickly. His attorney wasted no time launching accusations. They called her mentally unstable, emotionally volatile, and claimed she showed signs of prenatal depression that posed a risk to the child. As they spoke, she felt the walls press in. These were lies, carefully crafted to portray her as weak. She looked to Anthony, who remained calm, occasionally making notes. He leaned over and whispered, "Let them talk. They'll overplay their hand." She nodded, though her hands trembled beneath the desk. Her world was on trial, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The court called a surprise witness, a man she didn't recognize. He stepped into the box and claimed to have seen her arguing aggressively in public with a man outside a prenatal clinic. According to him, she was shouting and visibly distressed, behaving in a way that was alarming. The room grew tense. She blinked in disbelief, searching her memory for such an incident. Then it hit her. It had been a misunderstanding at the clinic's front desk, when her insurance had failed to cover an exam. She had argued with a staff member, not a stranger, and certainly not with any danger. Anthony stood and calmly began the cross-examination. He asked simple, direct questions. What was the date of this incident? The man hesitated. What was she wearing? He couldn't recall. Did you file any report? He had not. The truth unraveled quickly. It was clear he was coached, perhaps even paid. When the judge asked for clarification, the witness stammered and admitted he had been contacted by Simone. The courtroom shifted. A murmur spread across the benches. The judge looked displeased. Her husband adjusted his tie, suddenly uncomfortable. The lies meant to destroy her had just begun to crack under the weight of truth. During a short recess, she stepped into the hallway to breathe. The tension clung to her skin like smoke. She leaned against the wall, one hand resting protectively on her belly, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Suddenly, she heard footsteps. Simone approached, heels clicking sharply, a smug smile on her face. She leaned in, lowering her voice, and said, "You don't stand a chance. He never loved you. You were just convenient." The words struck like a slap. "After the baby's born, we'll raise it right. Without you." Then she turned and walked away, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and venom. She stood frozen, the words echoing in her head. Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry. Not here. Not now. She returned to the courtroom, more determined than ever. Every insult, every humiliation was fuel. They thought she was fragile because she was pregnant, alone, and quiet. But they didn't understand that carrying life made her stronger, not weaker. That courtroom wasn't just a battlefield, it was the place where she would prove her worth, where lies would collapse and truth would rise. If they wanted to crush her, they'd have to try harder. That evening, she collapsed on the couch, body aching with exhaustion. The stress had taken a toll. Her doctor had warned her weeks earlier that prolonged emotional strain could impact the baby. After today, the words felt real. She called her OBGYN and explained the symptoms: tightness, dizziness, shortness of breath. "Come in tomorrow," the doctor insisted. "We need to monitor you." The next day, the checkup revealed elevated blood pressure and signs of early preeclampsia. The doctor placed her on temporary bed rest and warned her, "Any more stress, and you risk going into labor early." She stared at the ceiling of the clinic, unable to speak. This was exactly what Simone and her husband wanted, to prove she was unfit. But it wasn't weakness. It was sacrifice. She was enduring all of this not for herself, but for the tiny life inside her. Anthony, upon hearing the update, adjusted their legal strategy. "We won't rush," he said. "Let's document everything. If they want to argue stability, we'll show what they've done to push you to this point." She nodded slowly, tears forming in the corners of her eyes, not from despair, but from the pain of holding it all together. 2 days before the next court appearance, Anthony received a call. "We have a lead," his paralegal said. A former associate of Simone had reached out, anonymously. She claimed Simone had orchestrated multiple unethical schemes in the past, including manipulating witnesses and pressuring testimony in prior civil cases. The woman agreed to meet privately and share documentation, as long as her name remained protected. Anthony arranged the meeting. The evidence was explosive emails, recorded calls, timelines. Enough to question Simone's credibility entirely. It was the break they hadn't dared hope for. When they returned to court, Anthony waited until the right moment. As Simone began another character attack, claiming the pregnant woman was irrational and delusional, Anthony stood. "Your Honor, we request to submit newly discovered evidence regarding the opposing counsel's conduct in this case." Simone's eyes flickered. Her husband looked at her, confused. The judge reviewed the documents and paused. The tone of the hearing shifted immediately. If these are verified, the judge said, we may need to consider whether this case has been ethically compromised. For the first time, her husband's expression changed from arrogant to uncertain. The first fracture in his resolve had appeared. The next morning, Anthony arrived with a flash drive in his hand and a quiet fire in his eyes. A former employee of the prenatal clinic had come forward, having seen the court coverage online. She remembered the alleged incident and pulled surveillance footage from that day. The video showed exactly what really happened: a billing error, a brief exchange with the receptionist, and nothing even remotely close to the aggressive scene described by the false witness. It was clear, undeniable, and time-stamped. She hadn't even noticed anyone watching her that day, let alone someone reporting it. Back in court, the footage was displayed on a screen before the judge. The silence in the room was deafening as the truth played out in full color. The judge leaned forward, hands clasped, face unreadable. Simone stared, lips pressed into a thin line, while her husband avoided looking in their direction. The false witness's testimony crumbled on the spot. Anthony turned and whispered to her, "This is how justice begins." She held her breath, watching not just her own defense, but the collapse of the lies that had tried to destroy her. After a brief recess, she took the stand. Her hands rested gently over her stomach as she answered questions with calm, quiet strength. Anthony guided her through the process, allowing her voice to carry the truth. When it came time for cross-examination, Simone didn't rise. Her husband did. He stood, walked slowly toward her, and began asking pointed questions meant to rattle her. "Would you say you're emotionally fragile?" he asked. "Would you agree that you're under extreme stress?" She looked at him, eyes steady, and replied, "Yes, I am under stress. Because I'm being dragged into court by the man who vowed to protect me." There was a pause. Then she leaned forward and asked him something no one expected. "Did you ever love me, or was I just part of a plan?" The courtroom fell still. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His jaw tightened, but no words came out. His silence was more revealing than any answer. For the first time, the image he had carefully crafted, the man wronged, the victim, began to unravel. It was no longer a story of emotional imbalance. It was a story of betrayal, power, and ego. And everyone in the room could feel it. In the back row of the courtroom, his parents sat in tense silence. They had once adored her, especially when the marriage was new. But when the separation happened, they had taken his side without hesitation. Now, their eyes tracked every word, every detail unfolding. When the video was shown, the mother's eyes narrowed. When the false testimony was exposed, she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. And when her daughter-in-law stood on the witness stand, composed and dignified, a flicker of something unexpected crossed their faces: regret. At the lunch break, as she sat alone in the hallway, her mother-in-law approached slowly. There was no greeting, only a pause, and then, "We didn't know it had come to this. I'm sorry." The words felt heavy, sincere. For a moment, she didn't respond. Then she nodded. "Thank you." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. A crack in the wall of indifference. The courtroom had become more than just a legal battleground, it was a mirror reflecting everyone's true self. And the reflection was beginning to haunt those who had turned their backs. Desperate for control, her husband made his next move. His attorney stood and requested an emergency motion. He wanted a paternity test. The courtroom stirred. Simone looked startled, clearly not consulted. The request hung in the air like a final insult. The judge, with measured patience, turned to Anthony. He calmly responded, "We have no objection." The test was conducted that afternoon. It was invasive, unnecessary, and humiliating, but she endured it without a word. She knew the truth. And more than that, she knew this move reeked of desperation. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling. The idea that he could publicly question the child's parentage felt like the final betrayal. Not just of her, but of the baby. Still, there was no fear in her heart, only exhaustion. "You and I," she whispered to the child inside her, "will be stronger than they ever were." Across the city, her husband paced alone, waiting for results that would soon remind him just how deeply he had underestimated the woman he left behind. 3 days later, the envelope was delivered under seal. The courtroom was full, tension humming beneath every breath. The judge opened the envelope and read the findings aloud, voice steady and deliberate. "Paternity is confirmed with 99.99% certainty." Her husband stared blankly at the table. Simone's posture stiffened. The air shifted. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was vindication. The doubts they tried to plant had died the moment the judge spoke those words. She didn't gloat, didn't smile. She simply sat there, hand resting calmly over her belly, eyes closed for one quiet moment of peace. The judge looked directly at her then, as if seeing her fully for the first time. "This court acknowledges the baseless nature of the claims made against the petitioner," he said. "And moving forward, we will take into account the harm these accusations have caused." It wasn't over yet, but the tide had turned. The truth had finally spoken for her. And for the first time since the nightmare began, she didn't feel like she was just surviving. She felt like she was winning. The judge's words lingered like a bell ringing in a cathedral, clear, powerful, and final. As the echoes faded, no one in the courtroom dared speak. Her husband stared forward, his jaw locked in place, unable to process the blow to his pride. Simone sat stiffly, trying to salvage her composed facade, but the corners of her mouth twitched with unease. Even the spectators, who had once whispered behind cupped hands, now sat quietly, their eyes shifting in discomfort. There was no victory celebration, no loud applause. Just silence. And in that silence, she finally exhaled a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Anthony leaned toward her and spoke softly. They built their argument on lies. And now, there's nothing left for them to stand on. She gave a small nod, tears threatening to rise, not from sadness, but from relief. This wasn't about revenge. It was about dignity. About reclaiming her truth in front of those who had stripped it from her piece by piece. The silence in the courtroom wasn't empty. It was full of everything they had tried to silence in her: grief, resilience, and strength. And now, at last, it was being heard. Anthony approached the bench again, carrying a slim folder in his hands. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to submit financial records from the respondent's company accounts, evidence that directly connects him to corporate fund misappropriation during the period in which he filed for full custody." Simone's head whipped around. Her husband's face went pale. The judge gestured for the bailiff to collect the documents. What followed was a methodical presentation of bank statements, wire transfers, and email correspondences that suggested funds had been moved discreetly into Simone's private consulting firm just weeks before the custody filing. Her husband tried to speak, but the judge raised a hand. "I will review this carefully. But if these documents are authenticated, we may be discussing more than custody today." It was the first time her husband looked afraid. Not just caught, but exposed. Simone, sensing the fallout, whispered something sharply in his ear, but he didn't respond. For a man who had orchestrated so much with confidence, he now looked like a child standing in front of consequences he never believed would arrive. The courtroom watched silently, and for the first time, he had no defense. The final hearing came faster than expected. She wore a pale dress, simple but strong, and sat quietly as the judge delivered his ruling. In light of the false testimony, confirmed paternity, medical concerns caused by the litigation process, and potential financial misconduct, the judge paused. The court grants full physical and legal custody to the petitioner. Visitation rights will be evaluated after birth, subject to further review. The gavel came down. Her husband didn't move. Simone stood, gathered her things, and left the room without a word. The silence returned, but this time, it belonged to her. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply breathed. For the first time in months, her breath didn't shake. Anthony placed a hand on her shoulder. You did more than win a case. You protected your child. And yourself. She nodded slowly. Her eyes were full, not of vengeance, but of peace. The courtroom emptied gradually, and she remained seated a while longer, letting the moment settle. The war was over. And though the scars would remain, she had emerged from the wreckage whole. 3 days after the verdict, she heard a knock at her door. When she opened it, he stood there, tired, disheveled, and with none of the arrogance he once wore like armor. "Can we talk?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. She stepped aside. He entered the living room like a stranger visiting someone else's past. He looked around at the framed ultrasound, the folded baby clothes, the soft light filtering through the curtains. And for the first time, he looked unsure of himself. "I made mistakes," he said. "I let everything fall apart. I wasn't ready. I didn't know what I wanted." She sat opposite him, arms folded over her growing stomach. He continued, "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to say it out loud." She looked at him for a long time, eyes unreadable. Then she replied, "You didn't just leave me. You tried to take everything from me. That's not something words fix." He lowered his gaze. "I know." He stood and lingered at the door. "She left," he added quietly. "After the ruling. She said nothing." He walked out. She closed the door behind him and exhaled. It wasn't closure. It was just the end. 2 weeks later, she received a letter from a local nonprofit. They had followed the court case, moved by the strength she had shown. "We'd like to invite you to speak at our next event for single mothers navigating legal hardship," the letter read. She stared at the paper, stunned. At first, she hesitated. She didn't feel like a speaker, much less a survivor. But something deep inside her stirred. Maybe her story could help someone else stand up again. Maybe her voice, once silenced by shame and fear, was ready to speak for others who hadn't yet found theirs. She replied with a quiet yes. Days later, as she stood in front of a small room filled with women holding babies and stories just like hers, she began to speak. Her voice was calm, steady. Not perfect, but real. And in that moment, she realized something: strength wasn't about standing alone in court. It was about standing back up after you've been knocked down. Her child kicked gently inside her, as if to remind her she wasn't alone anymore. She had a new beginning. And this time, it would be hers. The labor came earlier than expected. One quiet morning, as sunlight painted golden lines across her bedroom floor, her body began to tremble. At first, she thought it was just exhaustion. But within an hour, the contractions came strong and steady. She called her doctor, packed a small bag, and rode alone to the hospital. The nurses were kind, and Anthony, though no longer her lawyer, sent flowers to the room. When the baby finally arrived, a boy with soft eyes and strong lungs, her tears flowed freely. All the courtrooms, all the pain, all the nights of fear, it had all led to this. She held him close, his skin still warm from birth, and whispered promises into the tiny folds of his ear. Promises of safety, of patience, of love unshaken by anyone else's absence. For hours, she lay in silence, memorizing his face. No judge could measure this moment. No betrayal could undo it. The room was quiet, except for the sound of her child breathing against her chest. And for the first time in a very long time, her heart felt full, not in spite of what she endured, but because of what she overcame. A week after the birth, an envelope arrived at her door. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably careful. Inside was a folded letter and a small blue box. It was from his parents. They had not contacted her since the trial, but now their words carried a heaviness that only remorse could bring. We failed to see the truth when it mattered most. And we failed you, the letter began. They apologized for turning their backs, for believing in appearances, and for letting pride speak louder than love. Inside the box was a silver bracelet, engraved with the baby's name. She sat in the nursery, reading the letter again while her son slept nearby. Her fingers traced the words slowly. She didn't cry. There was no anger, no resentment left, just the ache of everything that had been lost, and the comfort in knowing not all bridges had to stay burned. She replied with a short note, "Thank you for your words. He will know kindness." It wasn't reconciliation, but it was grace. A quiet reminder that healing sometimes comes not in loud declarations, but in gentle, honest truths. Life settled into a rhythm she never imagined. Mornings with bottles and lullabies. Afternoons with walks through the park, the stroller rolling over fallen leaves. At night, she watched her son sleep and felt time slow down. She began working part-time remotely, writing legal content for non-profit organizations. The very system that had once threatened her had now become a place where she could offer guidance to others. Her story was being shared, not as gossip, but as inspiration. Women reached out, strangers who saw in her journey the courage they were still searching for. She didn't chase closure. She lived forward. Her apartment was small but filled with warmth. Photographs of her son filled the shelves, and each one told a chapter of love born from chaos. The pain still echoed at times, especially on quiet nights when memory knocked softly. But it no longer owned her. She was not just a survivor. She was a mother, a builder of something new. And for the first time in years, she could look in the mirror and feel proud of the woman staring back. The encounter was unplanned. She had been invited to speak on a panel about maternal rights at a local civic event. As she left the venue with her son in a carrier, she saw him standing by the doors, alone, older, thinner. He approached slowly, hands in his pockets. "He's beautiful," he said, voice low. She nodded. "He is." There was a pause, a silence loaded with years and things that could never be said properly. "I lost the firm," he admitted. "And her. Everything." She didn't flinch. "I know," she replied, her tone calm, without pity. He asked if he could write to the boy someday. She looked at him for a long moment, then said, "When he asks who you are, I'll tell him the truth. All of it. And when he's old enough, he can decide." He nodded, unable to meet her eyes. She turned and walked away, her son gurgling softly against her chest. She didn't look back. There was nothing left to recover. Only lessons. Only distance. And the weight of having chosen a better path when the world had tried to pull her under. Years passed, but her story didn't fade. It became something she wove into quiet conversations, into the way she raised her son, into how she helped women speak when they thought no one would listen. Her son grew tall and thoughtful, asking one day, "Were you scared when it was just us?" She smiled and replied, "Every day. But love is stronger than fear." He carried those words with him, just as she carried the strength of her journey in every step she took. They lived simply but richly, with kindness, with honesty, and with peace that came not from what they had, but from who they had become. And though the world never apologized for what it tried to take from her, she didn't need it to. Her victory wasn't in headlines or courtroom gavel strikes. It was in bedtime stories, in morning hugs, in the way her son looked at her like she held the whole world. She had been betrayed, humiliated, abandoned. But in the end, she built a life where none of that defined her. She had chosen love. And in doing so, she had already won.